When the storm hit, Silas Creed hadn't spoken to a soul in weeks. So, when 10 soaked women in buckskin and braids appeared at his gate followed by soldiers, he faced a choice that would either damn or redeem him. Silas Creed had buried his past 8 years back when he walked away from the war, the ranching gangs, and the death of his family. The memories haunted him, still the smell of smoke, the screams that echoed through the night, the way his daughter's favorite doll had been charred beyond recognition. He'd carried those images across 3 territories, through desert and mountain, until he found this canyon gulch south of Broken Mesa. Here, where the red rocks rose like cathedral walls and the wind sang through stone arches, he'd built a cabin with his own hands. Every plank, every nail, every stone of the foundation had been placed with the desperate precision of a man trying to rebuild not just a home, but a soul. The cabin had taken him 2 full years to complete. He'd started with nothing but his horse, a rifle, and the clothes on his back. The first winter he'd lived in a crude lean-to, gathering strength and planning. Spring brought the lumber, dragged plank by plank from the mill in Broken Mesa, each journey a 3-day round trip through treacherous mountain passes. Summer gave him the long days needed for construction, working from dawn to dusk with the methodical patience of a man who had nowhere else to go. The walls rose slowly, each board fitted with the precision of a craftsman, sealed with pitch and care against the harsh canyon winds. He'd planted squash in neat rows, tended a small garden of beans and corn, and spoke only to wind and rock. The garden had been his wife's idea, back when he still carried her voice in his head. She'd always said a man needed to see things grow, needed to put life back into the world if he'd taken too much out of it. The first year, the crops had failed. Too much sun, too little water, soil that needed years of care to become fertile. But he'd persisted, learning to read the subtle signs of weather and season, building irrigation channels from the stream that ran through the canyon's heart. The isolation had become his sanctuary. Days would pass where the only sounds were the creak of his rocking chair on the porch, the distant call of hawks circling overhead, and the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. He'd built that chair himself, carved from the same wood as the cabin, sized to his frame and worn smooth by years of use. From it he could see the entire length of the canyon, from the narrow gate where it opened onto the wider world to the blind end where cliffs rose sheer and unbroken toward the sky. He'd grown comfortable with the silence, had learned to read the language of clouds and the subtle shift of shadows that marked the passage of time. The clouds told him when rain was coming, when the wind would shift, when the seasons were changing. The shadows spoke of the day's progress, marking the hours with more certainty than any clock. He'd memorized every rock formation, every game trail, every place where water pooled after storms. This knowledge had become his Bible, more sacred than any words written by men. His rifle rested always within reach, not from paranoia, but from habit, a reminder of the world he'd left behind. It was a Winchester 73, worn smooth from use but meticulously maintained. Each morning he'd clean it, check the action, ensure the ammunition was dry and ready. Not because he expected trouble, but because the ritual grounded him, connected him to the careful precision that had kept him alive through 5 years of war and the violent aftermath. The isolation had cost him in other ways. His hair had grown long and streaked with gray, his beard wild and unkempt. His hands, once skilled with rope and rifle, had grown rough from woodworking and farming. He'd lost weight, muscle replaced by the lean hardness of a man who worked alone and ate sparingly. But his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning the horizon, reading the subtle signs that spoke of weather and danger. That changed the night 10 Apache women knocked on his gate. Rain hammered the ground with the fury of a celestial war drum, each drop striking the hard-packed earth with the force of bullets. The storm had been building for days, starting as a hot, oppressive weight in the air that made the horses nervous and the birds silent. The first clouds had appeared on the western horizon just after midday, towering thunderheads that rose like mountains into the sky. By evening, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of violence. Thunder broke the sky in half, each crack followed by lightning that turned the canyon into a stark landscape of black and white. The lightning was constant now, strobing through the clouds with increasing intensity. Each flash revealed the familiar landscape transformed into something alien and threatening. The red rocks seemed to pulse with their own inner light, the shadows deep and absolute in the brief darkness between strikes. Silas had been cleaning his rifle by lamplight when he heard it, not the knock itself, but something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. Horses, many horses, moving fast through the storm. He developed the hunter's instincts during his years of solitude, learning to identify sounds that didn't belong. The rhythm was wrong for wild horses, too disciplined, too purposeful. These were trained mounts, driven hard through dangerous conditions. He set down his cleaning cloth, checked the rifle's load, and stepped out into the tempest. The familiar ritual of preparation steadied him, but his heart was racing. In 8 years of isolation, no one had come to his gate. No one knew he was here, or so he'd believed. The sound of approaching horses could only mean one thing: trouble had found him at last. The rain hit him like a physical blow, soaking through his wool shirt in seconds. The drops were large and cold, driven by a wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. He pulled his hat low over his eyes and moved carefully across the slick wooden planks of his porch. The storm had turned the air thick as soup, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. He squinted through the downpour and saw them 10 figures pressed against his gate, their forms barely visible in the storm's fury. They clung to the wooden posts like shipwreck survivors, buffeted by wind and rain. The gate itself was swaying under the force of the storm, the iron hinges groaning in protest. Beyond them, barely visible in the darkness, more shapes moved through the rain, horses, riderless and frightened, milling about in the confusion. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment he could see them clearly. Women, Apache women in buckskin and braids, their faces streaked with mud and something darker. Blood. Their clothing was torn and soaked, clinging to their bodies like skin. Some carried weapons, bows, knives, a few rifles. Others clutched bundles that could have been personal possessions or ammunition. All of them looked exhausted, pushed beyond the limits of endurance. "Please," said the one in front. Her voice cut through the storm with surprising clarity, trained by years of calling across vast distances. The word carried the weight of desperation, but also a dignity that impressed Silas despite his caution. She was tall for an Apache woman, with the broad shoulders and strong hands of someone accustomed to hard work. Her name was Sani, though he wouldn't learn it until later. She stood tall and calm, though soaked to the bone, her long black hair plastered to her shoulders like a dark waterfall. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of his wife, not in appearance, but in the way she held herself. Proud, unbroken, even in this moment of extremity, she carried herself with the dignity of a queen. Her eyes, when the lightning revealed them, were dark and steady, meeting his gaze without flinching. She was afraid, he could see that, but she was also determined. This was a woman who had made hard choices and was prepared to make more. "We need shelter," she continued, raising her voice against the storm. "Soldiers are coming." Silas looked past her to the others' faces streaked with mud and blood. Yes, but also with something else. He saw no cowering in their eyes, no panic or hysteria. Instead, he saw the same quality he'd recognized in Sani, defiance and something else. A hardness he recognized because he'd seen it in his own reflection for 8 years. The look of people who had lost everything and were still standing. The youngest of the group couldn't have been more than 16, with the smooth skin and bright eyes of youth. But her hands were steady on the rifle she carried, and her stance spoke of training and experience. Beside her, an older woman with graying hair and lined face held a bundle that moved slightly, a child, he realized, wrapped in soaked blankets. The others ranged in age from their 20s to their 50s, but all carried themselves with the same deadly grace. Behind them, in the distance, he could hear it now. The sound that had made his blood run cold, hoofbeats, getting closer. The rhythm was different now, more organized, more threatening. These weren't the scattered horses of the women's party. These were cavalry mounts, trained and disciplined, carrying riders who knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they arrived. He thought of his wife, of his daughter, of the night soldiers had come to his door with different intentions. The memory was as sharp as if it had happened yesterday. The pounding on the door, the rough voices, the rough hands. the smell of smoke and the sound of screaming, the way his daughter's favorite doll had been charred beyond recognition, clutched in small hands that would never open again. He thought of the man he'd been before the war broke him and the man he'd become after. The man before had been a rancher, a neighbor, a citizen who believed in law and order. The man after was something else entirely, someone who had learned that law and order could be twisted into weapons, that uniforms could hide the worst kinds of evil. But somewhere between those two men, buried under years of guilt and isolation, was the person his wife had married. The man who couldn't ignore suffering, even when it was safer to do so. The decision came to him with the force of revelation, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Because 8 years of isolation had taught him that some choices defined you and some choices destroyed you. Because the sound of approaching horses brought back memories of his own family's last moments, and he wouldn't let it happen again. He opened the gate. The heavy wooden barrier swung inward with a creak of protest, fighting against the wind and rain. The iron hinges, crafted by the same blacksmith who had made the barrel bands for his rifle, held firm despite the storm's fury. The gate was his own design, built wide enough for a wagon but sturdy enough to stop a cavalry charge. He'd spent months on it, driven by the same compulsive attention to detail that had shaped everything else in his isolated domain. The women filed through quickly, their movements efficient and purposeful. These weren't refugees fleeing in panic, they were warriors making a tactical retreat. He could see it in the way they moved, in the silent communication that passed between them, in the way they automatically secured their weapons despite exhaustion and fear. They were trained, disciplined, professional. Whatever had happened to them, they hadn't been broken by it. He could see weapons beneath their soaked buckskin, the way they positioned themselves even in this moment of vulnerability. The youngest carried a bow and a quiver of arrows, their fletching protected by a waxed leather cover. The older woman with the child held a knife with a bone handle, worn smooth by years of use. Another carried a rifle that looked like it had been taken from a soldier, its brass fittings polished despite the rough conditions. "Barn's that way," Silas said, pointing through the rain toward the large wooden structure that housed his horses and supplies. "Root cellars behind the house. Pick your spot." The barn was another of his major construction projects, built to withstand the harsh canyon winters. The walls were thick timber, chinked with mud and straw, designed to keep the wind and rain out while providing adequate ventilation. The roof was solid, made from pine shingles he'd split himself, sealed with pitch and designed to shed water away from the foundation. It was warm, dry, and defensible, everything these women needed. Sonny nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between equals. The nod conveyed more than words could have, a recognition of mutual respect and shared understanding. She was accepting his offer, but also measuring the man who made it. Her eyes took in his appearance, his stance, the way he held his rifle. She was making the same kind of assessment he was, evaluating threat and opportunity in the space of a heartbeat. "We won't forget this," she said, and the words carried weight. This wasn't simple gratitude, but the promise of a debt that would be honored. "Don't thank me yet," Silas replied, closing the gate behind them with a solid thud. "Night's young." The words were more prophetic than he realized. The storm was far from over, and the approaching hoofbeats were getting closer. He could hear voices now, carried on the wind, orders being shouted, the jingle of spurs and weaponry. These weren't random pursuit, this was organized, systematic, professional. Whoever was chasing these women had resources and determination. He watched the women disappear into the barn and root cellar, their forms swallowed by the darkness. The rain continued its assault, turning the yard into a muddy quagmire. Lightning still strobed across the sky, but the thunder was beginning to fade, moving eastward with the storm's center. In an hour, maybe two, the worst of it would be over, but the real storm was just beginning. The pursuing soldiers would be here soon. He could feel it in his bones, the way his wife used to feel the approach of winter. They were close now, probably waiting for the worst of the storm to pass before making their final approach. Professional soldiers would use the weather to their advantage, letting it mask their movements while they positioned themselves for the final assault. He went back inside, ostensibly to get out of the rain, but really to think. The cabin felt different now, charged with a tension that hadn't existed an hour ago. The familiar objects, his books, his tools, the rough-hewn furniture he'd made with his own hands seemed to watch him from the shadows. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for was now at risk, but somehow that didn't frighten him as much as it should have. An hour later, the storm had settled into a steady downpour. The lightning had moved on, leaving only the constant drumbeat of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The worst was over, but the rain continued, turning the yard into a swamp and the surrounding countryside into a maze of treacherous footing and limited visibility. He went to check on the women, carrying a lantern to guide his way through the darkness. The barn was warm and dry, filled with the familiar smell of hay and horses. He found them clustered around a small fire they'd built in a metal bucket, using straw and wooden scraps from his supply. They'd chosen their positions carefully, able to see both the main entrance and the smaller door that led to the back of the building. Most of the women were dozing, but two remained on watch. Their vigilance was professional, constant, the kind of discipline that came from years of training and experience. They watched him approach without alarm, but their weapons remained close at hand. Trust, he realized, was a luxury these women couldn't afford. The woman with the child was among those by the fire. The baby was quiet now, exhausted by the ordeal, sleeping in its mother's arms. The woman looked up as he approached, her face a mask of worry and determination. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 20, with the soft features of someone who had been sheltered from the worst of the world's violence, but her eyes were older, aged by recent trauma. "The child," Silas said quietly. "Is it hurt?" "No," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's been a hard journey. I don't know how much more." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The strain was visible in her face, in the way she held her body. This was a woman at the end of her rope, held together by nothing more than maternal instinct and stubborn determination. "There's milk in the house," he said, "fresh from my cow, and some bread." She nodded gratefully, but made no move to leave the safety of the group. Trust, as he'd observed, was a luxury, but necessity was a harsh master, and the child needed food more than she needed the illusion of safety. He returned to the house and gathered what supplies he could spare. Bread, milk, some of the dried fruit he'd been saving for winter. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. The act of gathering food for strangers felt strange after 8 years of solitude, but also familiar. It awakened memories of his wife, of the way she'd insisted on feeding every visitor who came to their door. When he returned to the barn, he found the women more alert. Something had changed in the few minutes he'd been gone. The watchers were more tense, their weapons ready. The others had stirred from their rest, arranging themselves in defensive positions without seeming to move. "Riders," said the youngest woman, who had been positioned near the small back door. "Coming up the canyon. Still a ways off, but they are there." Silas nodded, unsurprised. The sounds of pursuit had been growing louder throughout the evening, and he'd been expecting this moment. The question was what to do about it. He could still turn the women out, claim ignorance when the soldiers arrived. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. But it would also be the choice that destroyed whatever remained of his soul. They huddled near his hearth, steaming and silent. The fire burned high, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin. The warmth seemed to awaken something in the women, not relief. They were too seasoned for that, but a momentary relaxation of vigilance. The constant tension that had held them together during their flight eased slightly, replaced by the watchful rest of soldiers in a secure position. He studied them as they settled into the unfamiliar safety of his home. They were all skilled fighters, that much was obvious. But they were also more than that. These were women with lives, families, communities. They had been part of something larger, something that had been taken from them by violence and betrayal. The way they moved, the way they communicated with subtle gestures and glances, spoke of deep connections forged over years of shared experience. The youngest sat closest to the fire, her youthful face made older by the shadows. She held her bow with the easy familiarity of someone who had been using it since childhood. Her fingers were calloused from years of drawing the string, her arms strong from the constant practice required to maintain accuracy. When she moved, it was with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, someone who had learned to move silently through forest and prairie. Beside her, a woman in her 30s cleaned a knife with methodical precision. The blade was worn from use and sharpening, but the edge was razor-sharp and the balance perfect. She held it like part of her body, testing the edge with the skill of someone who understood that her life might depend on its sharpness. Her face was impassive, but her eyes constantly moved, scanning the shadows and doorways for threats. The older woman with the child sat slightly apart, her body positioned to shield the sleeping baby from the worst of the firelight. She was maybe 40, with the kind of strength that came from years of hard work and harder decisions. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her hands were scarred from countless tasks. But her grip on the knife at her belt was steady, and her eyes were alert despite her exhaustion. The others arranged themselves in a loose circle, never quite turning their backs to the door. It was a formation that spoke of long practice, of battles fought and won through discipline and mutual trust. Even in the safety of the cabin, surrounded by walls and warmth, they maintained their vigilance. These were not women who had survived by chance or luck. He watched them from the kitchen as he prepared what food he could offer. The kitchen was small but well organized, with shelves lined with preserved foods and simple cooking implements. Everything was clean and in its place, maintained with the kind of obsessive care that characterized every aspect of his solitary life. But now, as he worked, it seemed different. The routine tasks of hospitality awakened memories of his wife, of the way she had welcomed visitors and made them feel at home. The food was simple but substantial. Jerky made from venison he'd shot the previous autumn, seasoned with herbs from the garden his wife had designed. Hardtack that he'd learned to make during his years of wandering, practical and filling if not particularly flavorful. Coffee that had been sitting in the pot since morning, strong and bitter but warming. It wasn't much, but it was what he had, and it was offered freely. He brought the food and sat across from them, his own rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach. The weapon was a constant reminder of the world beyond his walls, of the violence that had shaped his life and brought these women to his door. It was also a promise, spoken without words, that he would not be helpless if trouble came calling. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. It was the kind of question that required careful consideration, the kind that could reveal more than was safe to share. But it was also inevitable, the natural curiosity of a man who had offered shelter to strangers. The women exchanged glances, communicating in the silent language of people who had learned to trust each other with their lives. Sani studied his face for a long moment before speaking. The scrutiny was thorough and professional, the kind of assessment that weighed risk against necessity. She was the leader of this group, that much was clear from the way the others looked to her for guidance, but she was also a woman who understood that leadership meant making hard choices, sometimes including the choice to trust a stranger. "We were part of a peaceful trading band," she said finally, her voice steady despite the weariness that weighed on her shoulders. "Came down from the high country to trade with the settlements. Horses, hides, some silver work. We'd done it for years, never any trouble." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life that had been systematically destroyed. Trading bands were important parts of Apache culture, linking the isolated mountain communities with the wider world. They were also, as Silas knew from his years in the territory, highly skilled and disciplined groups that could cover vast distances through difficult terrain. "The trading was good," she continued, staring into the fire as if reading her story in the flames. "We had horses that the settlers wanted, furs that would bring good prices in the eastern markets. In return, we needed tools, ammunition, some luxury items that were hard to make in the mountains. It was a good arrangement, one that had worked for years." She paused, her eyes reflecting the pain of memory. "We were a mixed group. Some of us were traders, yes, but others were just along for the journey. My sister brought her silver work to sell. Maria there was buying cloth for her daughter's wedding. It was as much a social trip as a business one." The woman named Maria looked up from the knife she was cleaning, her face grim with remembered loss. She was one of the older women, with graying hair and hands that spoke of long years of skilled work. The mention of her daughter's wedding brought a flash of pain across her features, quickly suppressed, but not soon enough to hide from eyes that knew how to read such things. That changed when Captain Olin Vex arrived at Fort Dalton, Sonny continued. He had ideas about how to handle the Apache problem, said trading was just another form of warfare, said we were using it to scout for raids, to gather intelligence about the settlement's defenses. The name hung in the air like a curse. Vex, even in his isolation, Silas had heard whispers about the new captain, stories of increasing aggression and suspicious. The kind of officer who saw enemies everywhere and preferred simple solutions to complex problems. Were you? Silas asked, the question direct but not accusatory. He'd been a soldier once, knew the kind of thinking that led to such suspicions. In a world where survival often depended on knowing your enemy, the line between prudent caution and paranoid aggression was often razor thin. The woman next to Sonny Younger, with scars on her hands that spoke of knife work, laughed bitterly. The sound was harsh in the warm cabin, cutting through the steady rhythm of the rain. We were trading for coffee and sugar. My grandmother was making jewelry, real threatening stuff. The bitter irony in her voice spoke of innocence lost, of a world where making jewelry could be seen as a form of warfare, but Silas understood the thinking behind it. To a paranoid mind, any contact with the enemy was suspect. Any gathering of information was intelligence gathering. The fact that the information might be about coffee prices rather than military capabilities was irrelevant. Sonny silenced her with a look that was both gentle and firm. The leadership style was subtle but effective, maintaining discipline while allowing for the expression of the anger and frustration that all of them felt. It was the kind of control that came from years of responsibility, from making decisions that affected the lives of others. No, she said, addressing Silas directly. We weren't. We were exactly what we claimed to be, traders looking for honest deals with honest people. But Vex didn't care about honesty. He needed a victory, something to make his name in the Eastern papers. So he set fire to our village 3 nights ago. The words were spoken with the kind of careful control that spoke of pain held in check by sheer force of will. Setting fire to a village was an act of war, a declaration that the rules of civilization no longer applied. It was also, as Silas knew from his own experience, a particularly brutal way to make a point. Came at dawn when the men were out hunting, she continued, her voice growing harder with each word. Said it was retaliation for rustling, for raids that never happened. But the timing was too convenient, too perfect. He'd been watching us, planning this for weeks. The tactical implications were obvious to anyone who had military experience. A dawn raid on a village when the men were away wasn't a response to immediate provocation. It was a planned operation, carefully timed to maximize casualties and minimize resistance. The kind of attack that was designed to send a message rather than achieve a strategic objective. Silas felt his gut twist with memories of his own wife and daughter burned in a similar raid that had turned out to be anything but random. The pattern was familiar, the justification standard. Official reports would speak of retaliation and legitimate military action. The truth was usually much simpler and much more brutal. Your men, he asked, though he already knew the answer from the grim set of their faces. Cut down when they came running back, Sonny replied, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered in her eyes. Vex had planned it that way. Let them see the smoke, let them come running into an ambush. They were out hunting, you understand. Scattered across miles of countryside, armed with bows and hunting knives, they came back as individuals, not as a fighting force. It was a tactically sound plan if brutally executed. Divide the enemy, force them to react emotionally rather than strategically, then destroy them piecemeal. The kind of strategy that worked well against skilled fighters if you were willing to abandon any pretense of honor or justice. We fought back, she continued, her voice hardening with the memory of violence. Used bow, blade, and stone. Some of us got away. The simple words didn't do justice to what must have been a desperate and bloody fighting retreat. Fighting back against professional soldiers with superior weapons and numbers would have required incredible courage and skill. That any of them had survived spoke to their training and determination. How many? Silas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Started with 30 women and children, lost 20 getting here. The mathematics of slaughter, 30 had become 10, two-thirds of their number dead or captured in the space of 3 days. The survivors were the strongest, the most skilled, the most determined. But they were also the most hunted, the most desperate, the most dangerous. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Silas poured coffee, the bitter liquid steaming in the cool cabin air. The simple act of hospitality seemed somehow inadequate in the face of such systematic destruction, but it was what he had to offer, and it was given freely. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but he could hear something else now. The hoofbeats had stopped, but they were still out there, waiting. Professional soldiers would use the storm as cover, positioning themselves while the weather masked their movements. They were close now, perhaps close enough to see the light from his windows. "So now Vex has labeled you outlaws," he said, the words as much statement as question. "War criminals." "That's right," Sonny replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Says we murdered soldiers in cold blood, put a bounty on our heads, but it's not about justice." The bounty system was another familiar tactic, one that turned the civilian population into an extension of the military. When the government put a price on your head, everyone became a potential enemy. It was an effective way to ensure that the hunted had nowhere to run, no safe haven where they could rest and recover. "It's about erasing us," she continued, her voice growing harder. "Making sure no one ever hears our side of the story. Making sure that when the history books are written, there's only one version of events." That was the real strategy, the one that extended beyond immediate military considerations. Control the narrative, control the truth, control the future. Make sure that the victims were remembered as criminals if they were remembered at all. It was the kind of strategy that worked if you were willing to use it. Silas understood. He'd seen it during the war, the way truth became the first casualty, how the victors wrote the history books. The difference between a patriotic action and a war crime was often nothing more than which side you were on when the fighting stopped. The winners got to tell the story, and the losers were remembered as they chose to remember them. "Why come here?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Why not keep running?" "Because we're tired of running," Sonny replied, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and determination. "And because—" she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because we heard about you, the man who walks away from fights, the one who minds his own business." The reputation was both accurate and incomplete. He had walked away from fights, had made a deliberate choice to avoid the violence that had defined his earlier life. But the reasons were more complex than simple cowardice or indifference. He'd walked away because he'd seen too much, done too much, lost too much to believe that violence solved anything. "That's me," he said, the words carrying more weight than they seemed to deserve. "But also the one who doesn't let innocents die, not if he can help it." The words struck him like a physical blow. The reputation was more complete than he'd realized, more accurate than he'd hoped. Somewhere in the years of isolation and self-imposed exile, word had spread about his true character. The news was both flattering and terrifying. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The implication was clear: they hadn't come here by accident, hadn't chosen his canyon as a random refuge. They'd come here specifically because they believed he might help them. The knowledge was both honored and burden, a responsibility he'd thought he'd left behind. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he feared the answer. "Your wife, your daughter, we heard what happened to them, how you tried to save them, how you've been carrying that weight ever since." The words were spoken gently, but they cut like knives. The story he'd thought buried with his family was known, had somehow spread across the territory like wildfire. The most private tragedy of his life had become public knowledge, distorted and mythologized by retelling. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas set down his coffee, his hands suddenly unsteady. The familiar weight of memory pressed down on him, the images he'd tried so hard to suppress flooding back with vivid clarity. The smell of smoke, the sound of screams, the sight of his daughter's favorite doll charred beyond recognition. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't I?" Sonny's reply was gentle but relentless. You built this place as a monument to guilt. Beautiful, peaceful, isolated, the perfect place to hide from the world. But hiding isn't living, Seela's creed, and deep down you know it. The words struck home with the accuracy of a well-aimed rifle shot. She was right, of course. The cabin, the garden, the careful isolation, it was all a monument to failure, a shrine to the people he'd been unable to save. But it was also a prison, a place where he could punish himself for surviving when others had died. "I tried to save them," he said, the words forced out by the weight of memory. "I tried everything, but I was too late, too slow, too weak. They died because I failed. They died because evil men chose to kill them," Sonny replied, her voice firm with conviction. "Just like my family died because Vex chose to murder them. The guilt belongs to the killers, not the survivors." The logic was simple and true, but it did little to ease the weight of self-recrimination. Guilt was a familiar companion, one that had shaped every decision for 8 years. It was easier to blame himself than to accept that some things were beyond his control, that some tragedies couldn't be prevented by individual action. "You have a choice to make," Sonny continued, her voice taking on a different quality. "You can stay here in your monument to guilt, or you can choose to make their deaths mean something. You can choose to save people who still have a chance." The choice was simple, but not easy. It meant abandoning the careful isolation he'd built, the safe distance from a world that had taken everything from him. It meant risking everything once again, trusting in the possibility of redemption rather than the certainty of guilt. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of exhausted women. The moment stretched like a taut wire, balanced on the edge of decision. Everything that had come before, all the years of isolation and self-imposed exile, had led to this moment. The choice was his and his alone. The women slept that night in his barn and cellar, but none let go of their weapons. Despite his offer of safety, they remained armed and alert, understanding that true safety was an illusion in a world where soldiers could appear at any moment. Silas had offered them his bed, his floor, anywhere inside the cabin, but Sonny had declined with a shake of her head. "We don't want to make you a target," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of hard experience. "Bad enough we brought trouble to your door. If they come tonight, we don't want them to find you harboring fugitives." The consideration was typical of her leadership style, thinking not just of immediate safety, but of the longer-term consequences. She understood that his willingness to help them was a gift that shouldn't be repaid with unnecessary risk. But she also understood that by accepting his shelter, they had already compromised his safety. There was no going back from that choice. He'd shown them the various hiding places around his property, the fruit of 8 years of careful planning and paranoid preparation. The root cellar had been dug deep into the hillside, with a concealed entrance and multiple escape routes. The barn had a hidden loft, accessible by a ladder that could be quickly pulled up. The house itself had firing positions and reinforced walls, designed to withstand a determined assault. "You've been expecting trouble," Maria observed as he showed them the fortified positions. "I've been expecting em to find me eventually," he replied. "Man can't hide forever." But the truth was more complex than simple paranoia. The defensive preparations were part of his mourning process, a way of honoring the family he'd failed to protect. By making his new home defensible, he was symbolically undoing his past failure. It was a form of penance, a way of saying that if he'd been better prepared, if he'd been more careful, his wife and daughter might still be alive. As the women settled into their chosen positions, Silas found himself unable to sleep. The familiar routine of his isolated life had been shattered, replaced by the sharp awareness of danger that he'd thought he'd left behind. The sound of rain on the roof, which had been comforting for 8 years, now seemed to mask the approach of enemies. He sat in his rocking chair, rifle across his knees, watching the storm rage outside. The position was strategic, giving him a clear view of the approach to his gate while keeping him concealed from outside observers. The chair itself was worn smooth by years of use, fitted to his body like a second skin. But tonight it felt different, charged with the electric tension of impending conflict. The rain had settled into a steady downpour, the kind of persistent precipitation that could last for hours. It was good for the garden, good for the water supply, but bad for visibility and movement. The storm was nature's way of slowing down the pace of events, forcing both hunter and hunted to wait for better conditions. But the lightning had moved on, leaving only the rumble of distant thunder. The worst of the storm was passing, which meant that the soldiers would be moving soon. Professional cavalry would use the cover of the storm to position themselves, then strike when visibility improved. The timing was predictable, which made it both easier to prepare for and more dangerous to face. He thought about what Sonny had said about his wife and daughter, about the weight he'd been carrying. She wasn't wrong, of course. The cabin, the garden, the careful isolation, it was all a monument to failure. But it was also something else, something he'd been afraid to acknowledge even to himself. It was a form of penance, a way of punishing himself for the sin of surviving when others had died. The guilt was a familiar companion, one that had shaped every decision for 8 years. It was easier to blame himself than to accept that some things were beyond his control, that some tragedies couldn't be prevented by individual action. But it was also a kind of self-indulgence, a way of making his own suffering the center of the world. He'd been away when it happened, tracking stolen cattle with a posse from town. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been playing protector to other people's property while his own family was being murdered. The work had been routine, the kind of thing he'd done dozens of times before. But this time, the routine had lasted too long, taken him too far from home. The trail had led south, through broken country that was perfect for hiding stolen livestock. The thieves had been skilled, covering their tracks and using the terrain to their advantage. It had taken 3 days to corner them, 3 days of hard riding and careful tracking. When they'd finally caught up with the rustlers, the fight had been brief but violent. He'd been in the middle of dividing the recovered cattle when the messenger arrived. A young man from town, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with bad news. The message was simple and devastating. "Your family is dead, your house is burned, come home." The ride back had been the longest of his life, made worse by the knowledge that every mile traveled was a mile too late. He'd pushed his horse to the limit, switching to fresh mounts from the recovered herd when his own began to falter. But no amount of speed could change what had already happened. By the time he returned, the house was ashes and his family was buried under a cottonwood tree. The burial had been hasty, driven by practical considerations rather than ceremonial ones. The bodies had been too badly burned for proper laying out, too damaged by the fire to be properly mourned. He'd arrived in time to see the last of the smoke still rising from the ruins. The investigation, such as it was, had been perfunctory. The sheriff was a good man, but he was also overworked and understaffed. The official story was that raiders had struck while the men were away, a common enough occurrence in the lawless territory. But the details didn't fit. The timing was too convenient, the brutality too systematic. He'd conducted his own investigation, using skills learned during 5 years of war. The tracks told a different story, one of careful planning and deliberate brutality. The attackers had been white men, not Indians. They'd been well-armed and well-organized, not the desperate band of raiders the official story described. They'd known exactly when to strike, exactly where to find their targets. The men who'd done it were long gone, disappeared into the vastness of the territory. But Silas had skills too, learned in the hard school of military service. He tracked them for months, living on rage and whiskey, following a trail that led through 3 territories and into Mexico. The pursuit had become an obsession, the only thing that kept him moving when grief threatened to paralyze him. He'd finally cornered them in a box canyon near the Mexican border. 3 men, tired and careless, their horses worn down by months of running. They'd made a mistake, let their guard down, allowed themselves to be trapped by the same terrain that had protected them for so long. The confrontation had been brief, brutal, and final. What happened there still haunted his dreams. The killing hadn't been clean or quick, hadn't been the kind of justice that satisfied the law. It had been personal, intimate, the kind of violence that stained your soul and changed you forever. By the time it was over, he'd become something he didn't recognize, something that frightened him more than any enemy. The revenge had been swift and brutal, but it hadn't brought his family back. Nothing could do that. The emptiness remained, the same hollow ache that had driven him across 3 territories in search of men who deserved to die. Killing them had been satisfying in the moment, but it had also been empty, a gesture that changed nothing important. So he'd walked away from everything: the ranch, the town, the life he'd built with his wife and daughter. The place held too many memories, too many reminders of what he'd lost. The people there looked at him differently now, not as a victim deserving sympathy, but as a man who'd gone too far, who'd let his grief turn into something darker and more dangerous. The journey to the canyon had been a form of exile, a way of removing himself from a world that no longer made sense. He'd wandered for months, drifting from place to place with no destination in mind. The money from the sale of his property had been enough to buy supplies and basic necessities, but it hadn't bought him peace or purpose. He'd found the canyon by accident, following a game trail that led to water during a particularly dry spell. The place had appealed to something deep in his nature, a need for beauty and solitude that had been awakened by trauma. The red rocks, the clear stream, the sense of ancient peace here all seemed to offer something that the world of men had taken away. The decision to stay had been gradual, made without conscious thought. One day became a week became a month became a year. By the time he'd acknowledged that this was his new home, he'd already begun the process of building a life around solitude and memory. The cabin had started as a shelter, but it had become something more: a shrine to the past, a fortress against the future. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sweet. The change was dramatic, from the violence of the storm to the crisp clarity of a washed sky. The sun rose like a promise, painting the red rocks with golden light and filling the canyon with the sweet scent of wet earth and growing things. Silas was making coffee when he heard the signal: a hawk's cry that wasn't quite right. The sound cut through the morning silence like a blade, too sharp, too regular to be natural. He'd learned to recognize the warning signs during his years of military service, the subtle ways that trained warriors communicated danger. He stepped outside, his rifle ready, and saw Taya, one of the younger women, crouched behind a boulder near the canyon rim. She was positioned to have a clear view of the approach to the canyon, her body motionless except for the slight movement of her eyes as she scanned the horizon. The positioning was professional, chosen for maximum visibility with minimal exposure. "Scouts," she called down softly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. 3 miles downwind, maybe 40 men. The number was about what he'd expected, but it was still daunting. 40 professional soldiers against 10 women and 1 aging rancher. The odds were not encouraging, but they weren't impossible either. The canyon provided natural defensive advantages, and the women were skilled fighters. It would be a matter of tactics, timing, and luck. Silas nodded and went to the barn. The women were already up, their weapons checked and ready. They'd slept in shifts, 2 always on watch while the others rested. The system was professional, disciplined, the kind of organization that spoke of long experience with dangerous situations. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses, but it was also filled with the subtle tension of warriors preparing for battle. Each woman was checking her equipment, making sure her weapons were clean and ready. The process was methodical, practiced, the kind of ritual that preceded every engagement. He found Sani near the back of the barn, working on a broken bowstring. Her movements were careful and precise, the kind of skilled work that came from years of practice. The bow was a beautiful weapon, made of wood that had been carefully selected and seasoned, wrapped with sinew and polished to a high sheen. It was also, he realized, a work of art as much as a tool of war. 40 men, he told her, keeping his voice low, too many for a straight fight. The assessment was accurate but not necessarily final. 40 men was a lot, but they were also operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who knew the ground. The canyon provided natural choke points, places where a smaller force could hold off a larger one, but it would require careful planning and skilled execution. "We've faced worse odds," she replied, not looking up from her work. The statement was delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that spoke of experience rather than bravado. These women had been tested in battle, had proven their ability to fight and survive against superior forces. "Maybe, but not here, not in my canyon." He looked around at the faces watching him, reading the mixture of determination and fear that was natural before any battle. "There's an old mining sluice up the canyon, built to wash gold from the stream, if we could divert water from the upper pools." The mining sluice was a remnant of the canyon's earlier inhabitants, gold prospectors who'd worked the stream for 2 seasons before moving on to richer claims. The system was simple but effective, using a series of wooden gates to control the flow of water from the natural pools above. It had been abandoned for years, but the mechanism was still functional. "Flood the lower pass," Sonny finished, understanding the strategy immediately. "Drown half of them in the narrows." The tactic was sound, if brutal. The narrow pass was the only practical approach to the canyon, and it could be turned into a death trap with the right preparation. A sudden flood would catch the approaching soldiers by surprise, sweeping away horses and men in a torrent of water and debris. It would work, he acknowledged, then hesitated. But it would also mean— "I know what it would mean," she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "We'd be killing them all, even the ones who might not deserve it." The moral dimension was one that couldn't be ignored. Not all of the soldiers were responsible for the massacre of her village. Some were just following orders, doing what they thought was their duty. But in the chaos of a flood, there would be no way to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Silas studied her face, reading the conflict that lay beneath the surface. She was a warrior, trained to kill when necessary, but she was also a woman of conscience who understood the weight of taking life. The struggle was visible in her eyes, the tension between survival and morality. "You have a problem with that?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I have a problem with becoming the monsters they say we are," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "If we kill without discrimination, if we become the savage enemies they claim we are, then they win. Even if we survive, they win." The insight was profound, touching on the deeper strategy of the conflict. The soldiers weren't just trying to kill these women, they were trying to justify their own actions by proving that their enemies were savage and deserving of destruction. By maintaining their humanity, the women were fighting a different kind of battle, one that was harder to win but more important in the long run. But the immediate problem remained. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with superior training and equipment. The flood would even the odds, but it would also cost them something essential. The question was whether they could afford to maintain their moral standards in the face of annihilation. The decision, when it came, was made not by argument or analysis, but by simple human need. As they debated the merits of the flood strategy, preparing the sluice for activation, they heard something that changed everything. It came from the direction of the approaching soldiers, carried on the clear morning air like a knife through silk. A baby's cry. The sound was thin and desperate, the kind of cry that spoke of hunger, fear, and abandonment. It cut through all their preparations, all their tactical discussions, all their carefully constructed plans. In that moment, everything changed. The abstract became personal, the strategic became moral, the possible became necessary. It came from the soldiers' direction, carried on the clear morning air with the kind of clarity that made discussion impossible. The cry was unmistakable, the sound of an infant in distress. It was the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the primal human need to protect the innocent. Silas felt his blood turn to ice. The implications were immediate and terrible. If the soldiers had a baby with them, it meant they had prisoners. It meant that the flood strategy would kill not just enemy combatants, but innocent civilians. It meant that the choice between survival and morality had just become much more complex. Sonny halted, her hand frozen on the sluice release. The wooden lever was polished smooth by years of use, worn by the hands of men who had dreamed of finding gold in the stream. But now it represented something else entirely: the power to kill or spare, to become the monsters their enemies claimed they were, or to remain the people they had always been. "They took captives?" she asked, though the question was more statement than query. The existence of the crying baby was proof of something she had hoped to avoid, the knowledge that their enemies were not just soldiers, but men who preyed on the innocent. "Or brought a cook and her babe," Silas muttered, but he didn't believe it. The cry was too desperate, too frightened to be from a camp follower's child. This was the sound of a prisoner, someone who had been taken against their will and was now being used as a human shield. The other women looked to Sani for orders, their faces reflecting the same moral struggle that was visible in her own. They had come too far, lost too much, to let sentiment stop them now. But the sound of that baby's cry had changed everything, made the abstract moral questions immediate and personal. "If we flood the pass now," Taya said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of hard experience, "we kill the child too." The younger woman had moved from her position on the rim, coming closer to hear the discussion. Her face was grim with the knowledge that their options had just become much more limited. The flood strategy had been brutal but effective. Now it was simply unthinkable. "We don't know there's a child," Maria argued, but her voice lacked conviction. The older woman had seen too much, lost too much, to easily abandon a strategy that might save their lives. But even she couldn't ignore the evidence of their own ears. "Could be," Sani agreed, her voice carefully neutral. "But can we risk it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. It was the kind of moral choice that defined character, the kind of decision that would shape not just their immediate fate, but their long-term ability to live with themselves. They could use the flood, possibly save their own lives, and definitely kill a baby. Or they could abandon the strategy, face the soldiers on more equal terms, and hope that their skills and determination would be enough. Silas cursed, kicked the sluice gate closed with more force than necessary. The decision had been made, not by strategy or calculation, but by simple human decency. The mechanism groaned and settled back into position, the wooden gears creaking with the sound of opportunity closing. "We go to Plan B," he announced, shouldering his rifle with the kind of determined resignation that spoke of hard choices accepted. "Which is?" Sani asked, though she was already moving, gesturing for the other women to prepare for a different kind of battle. "Haven't figured that out yet," he admitted, checking his ammunition with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been in this situation before. "But it starts with getting that child out of there." The honesty was refreshing, even in the face of immediate danger. Most leaders would have pretended to have a plan, would have projected confidence they didn't feel. But Silas had learned, through years of war and loss, that honesty was often more useful than false bravado. Sani grinned, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. The expression transformed her face, revealing the humor and warmth that still existed beneath the hardened warrior. "Front assault! No, diversion, you 5 make noise at the ridge. I'll circle north with 2 of you. We get the woman and child, then figure out what comes next." The plan was simple, which made it both easy to execute and easy to understand. Simple plans were often the best in situations like this, where too many variables could make complex strategies impossible to implement. The key was to create confusion, use the terrain to their advantage, and act quickly before the enemy could respond. "And if it's a trap?" Taya asked, voicing the concern that was in everyone's mind. The existence of the baby could be a ruse, a way to lure them into abandoning their defensive position and exposing themselves to attack. "Then we die trying to save someone instead of living with their death on our hands," Silas replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. The words were simple, but they contained the essence of the choice they were making. Some things were worth dying for, and the life of an innocent child was one of them. The plan was dangerous, splitting their small force and abandoning the tactical advantage of the sluice. But the alternative was unthinkable. None of them, not even Maria with her pragmatic streak, could bring themselves to knowingly kill a child. The moral cost would be too high, the damage to their souls too great. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for the new strategy. The work was different now, focused on mobility and stealth rather than defensive positioning. Weapons were checked and rechecked, ammunition distributed, escape routes memorized. The preparation was thorough but urgent, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. As the sun climbed higher, the tactics became more specific. The diversion would be carefully calculated, enough noise to draw attention without suggesting a large force. The goal was to make the soldiers think they were facing a desperate last stand, not a tactical maneuver designed to create an opening for rescue. The rescue team would be smaller, more mobile, able to move quickly through the broken terrain north of the canyon. The approach would be dangerous, requiring them to cross open ground and navigate around enemy positions. But it was possible if they were careful and skilled enough. "If this goes wrong," Sani said to Silas as they prepared to separate, "don't blame yourself, we chose this." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they carried their own weight. She was absolving him of responsibility, but she was also acknowledging the very real possibility that they would all die in the attempt. The choice was made, but the outcome was far from certain. "I've been blaming myself for 8 years," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of constant self-recrimination. "One more won't matter," but even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. This was different, somehow more important than his previous failures. This was a choice made in full knowledge of the consequences, a decision to risk everything for the sake of strangers. If they failed, if they died, it would be because they had chosen to maintain their humanity in the face of impossible odds. As evening approached, they took their positions. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the red rocks with golden light. The beauty of the moment was almost surreal, a stark contrast to the violence that was about to unfold. But beauty and violence had always been close companions in this land, separated by nothing more than the choices of the people who lived there. The diversion team moved into position on the ridge, their weapons ready and their resolve firm. The plan was simple but required precise timing. They would make their presence known, draw the soldiers' attention, and hold it long enough for the rescue team to reach the enemy camp. The rescue team was smaller: Silas, Taya, and one of the older women whose name was Maria. The selection was based on skill and necessity, choosing those who were most likely to succeed in the dangerous mission. The others would provide the diversion, a task that was equally dangerous but different in nature. The approach to the enemy camp was treacherous, requiring them to navigate through broken terrain in failing light. The soldiers had chosen their position well, with clear fields of fire and natural barriers that would make direct assault suicidal. But they had also focused their attention on the canyon entrance, leaving the northern approach less heavily defended. As they prepared to move out, Silas felt the familiar tension of impending combat. It was a feeling he had hoped never to experience again, the mixture of fear and excitement that preceded every battle. But there was something different this time, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his earlier conflicts. This wasn't about revenge or politics or abstract principles. This was about saving an innocent life, about choosing to act rather than simply endure. It was about the kind of moral courage that his wife had always believed was the most important quality a person could possess. The diversion began at nightfall, with the sound of war cries echoing through the canyon. The noise was carefully calculated, designed to suggest a larger force than actually existed. The women on the ridge made themselves visible, their weapons flashing in the dying light, their voices carrying across the broken terrain. The response was immediate and professional. The soldiers reacted with the kind of disciplined efficiency that spoke of extensive training and experience. They moved to defensive positions, concentrated their fire on the ridge, and prepared for a sustained assault. It was exactly the kind of response that the plan had been designed to provoke. While the soldiers were distracted, the rescue team moved through the darkness toward the enemy camp. The journey was slow and dangerous, requiring them to move carefully through unfamiliar terrain while avoiding the patrols that the soldiers had undoubtedly deployed. Every step was fraught with risk, every sound a potential betrayal. The enemy camp was larger than they had expected, with enough supplies for an extended campaign. The soldiers had made themselves comfortable, confident in their superior numbers and weapons. But they had also made the mistake of underestimating their opponents, a mistake that would cost them dearly. The rescue itself was a masterpiece of stealth and precision. They located the source of the crying, disabled the guard, and freed the prisoners in a matter of minutes. The woman with the baby was Mexican, young and terrified, but still capable of action. Her husband had been killed, but she had survived, and now she had a chance to escape. The retreat was harrowing, complicated by the need to move slowly and quietly while carrying a baby. Every step was a risk, every sound a potential disaster. But they made it, reaching the safety of the canyon just as the diversion was beginning to wind down. It was only then that disaster struck. A second column of soldiers appeared on the eastern ridge, their numbers overwhelming. The tactical situation had just shifted from difficult to impossible. The diversion team was trapped, outnumbered, and facing certain death. But even in the face of disaster, there were opportunities. The new column was led by a young officer who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. When they captured him, sealers saw something in the young man's eyes that gave him hope. It was the look of someone who knew that what they were doing was wrong, someone who might be willing to do something about it. The interrogation was brief but revealing. The young officer, Lieutenant Reuben Malkin, was the son of the commanding colonel. He had been present at the massacre, had seen the brutality firsthand, and was sickened by what he had witnessed. Most importantly, he had access to evidence that could expose the truth. The decision to trust him was a desperate gamble, but it was also the only option available. If he could be convinced to testify about what he had seen, if he could be persuaded to tell the truth to the federal agents who were investigating the situation, then justice might be possible. The ride to Fort Dalton was a journey of hope and fear, carrying with them the evidence that could change everything. The federal agents were already there, already asking questions, already suspicious of the official story. When they heard the truth, when they saw the evidence, they acted with the kind of swift justice that was rare in the territory. The investigation was thorough, the trials were swift, and the verdicts were just. The guilty were punished, the innocent were protected, and the truth was finally told. It was the kind of justice that restored faith in the system, that proved that individual actions could make a difference. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. The woman with the baby was reunited with her family. The Apache women were granted protection and the right to live in peace, and Silas found himself looking toward the future instead of the past. The canyon remained, but it was no longer a prison or a monument to guilt. It was simply a place where a man had chosen to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. The storm that had brought them together had passed, leaving behind a world that was cleaner, brighter, and more hopeful. The memory of those 3 days would stay with all of them, a reminder that even in the darkest times, it was possible to choose hope over despair, courage over fear, and humanity over hatred. In the end, the choice had been simple. When strangers came to his gate in the midst of a storm, Silas had opened it. When they needed shelter, he had provided it. When they needed help, he had given it. The cost had been high, but the reward had been higher. He had saved not just their lives, but his own soul, and in doing so, had proved that redemption was possible for anyone willing to make the effort. The story would be told and retold, passed down through generations, as a reminder of what was possible when people chose to act with courage and compassion. It would become a legend, a myth, a story that inspired others to open their own gates when strangers came calling. But for those who had lived it, it would always be more than a story. It would be a reminder that in a world full of darkness, there was still the possibility of light, and that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply choose to be human.